My name is Jennifer McKinnon, and I am the Senior Manager of Professional Education and Clinical Practice at the Lung Health Foundation. We are pleased to present to you today this webinar on asthma action plans, keeping asthma under control, especially in this virtual world. The presentation will roughly be about 45 minutes, and we'll take time at the end to address any questions. You'll be able to type your questions into the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Before we get started, we would like to ask you a couple of questions. So I'll get Gloria to put the first polling question up on the screen. Here we go. So you'll be able to answer this question just by using your mouse and clicking on your response. And Gloria, can you ask the first polling question?
What should we do in the yellow zone if she was on fluticasone furoate 100 mcg, 1 puff OD?
So that's the question for later on. Can you ask the question, that's polling question number 1? Great. So do you currently use an adult or pediatric asthma action plan with your clients with asthma? So here are your selections. Yes, I use a written action plan. Yes, I use a verbal action plan. Or no, I don't use an action plan. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer. Okay, so Gloria, can you show the results and we'll see how we did there? So 71% said that they use written action plans. So thank you. Great. So the next question, Gloria. All right, so what are the barriers to using asthma action plans with your clients? And in this question, you have the opportunity to select as many of those options as you wish. So lack of time, lack of confidence in completing an action plan with your client, action plans are not available at the point of care, the guidelines are confusing, you don't believe your client will use it properly, or you have difficulty using it in a virtual care setting, or maybe there are no barriers for you. So please select which one applies. So again, you can select a number of options there. So Gloria, let's see what we have. Okay, so we have a few barriers identified. It looks like the number 1 is lack of time. So thank you for sharing with us. So we'll move ahead here. At the end of the webinar, you'll also have an opportunity to provide some feedback to us. So please take that opportunity. And just a reminder that this webinar has been certified with the College of Family Physicians of Canada for 2 Main Pro Plus credits. So if those apply to you, please make sure you take advantage of that. And thank you for attending. I will take the opportunity now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Gupta is a clinician scientist at the Li Ka-shing Knowledge Institute of St. Michael's Hospital and an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. He is a staff respirologist in the Division of Respirology at St. Michael's Hospital. He completed his master's degree in clinical epidemiology at the University of Toronto, followed by a fellowship in knowledge translation research. His main research interest is in knowledge translation in primary care across the spectrum of respiratory illness with a focus on electronic tools and asthma. He serves as chair of the Canadian Respiratory Guidelines Committee and holds the University of Toronto Michael Lock Term Chair in Knowledge Translation and Rare Lung Disease Research. So welcome, Dr. Gupta. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Gloria, if you want to make Dr. Gupta the host. So is it Gloria? Gloria? There we go. Thank you.
Okay. I'm just going to put up my PowerPoint slides here. I'm not able to share the window. I can only share the entire screen, but it should be workable. Just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen right now, see my slides.
Yes, it looks good.
Great. So I'm Samir Gupta, and very happy to be here today. Thank you for joining us for this webinar in these strange times. We're going to talk about asthma action plans mostly today, and generally speaking, how asthma action plans can help us to keep asthma under control with our patients. But it'll be a little bit of a different twist on the presentation in that we'll focus on a little bit, in some areas, on aspects that have to do with how our management strategies will have to evolve in the current virtual world that many of us are dealing with respect to seeing our patients virtually and trying to deliver all sorts of complex care in a virtual world. There is a Q&A mechanism through the Zoom interface that we will open up at the end of the talk. We should have at least 10, maybe 15 minutes at the end for questions. There will be a couple of polls that I'll put through during the talk as well, out of interest. So to start with, I have no relationships with for-profit commercial interests. I do have relationship with the Ontario Lung Association and several different granting agencies, peer-reviewed granting agencies. I will be talking a little bit about ICS dosing off-label during this talk. The talk is funded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. That's a program supported at the Lung Health Foundation. The content is supported by several different published resources, including the 2012 Canadian Thoracic Society Asthma Guideline, the more recent Severe Asthma Guideline from the CTS in 2017, and then the GINA report that came out most recently, and a peer-reviewed publication from a few years ago focused on asthma action plans. So the objectives, as you've seen on the emails and the posters, are to describe the evidence supporting the use of asthma action plans to effectively manage asthma. So are action plans effective, and how certain are we that giving our patients an action plan will actually make things better for them? To understand the barriers to use of asthma action plans in general, but particularly also in the current environment that we're dealing with, which is the environment, as we talked about, which involves a lot of virtual care. Applying evidence and practical tips for stepping up therapy in the yellow zone of the asthma action plan, and also discussing potential solutions to using an asthma action plan in a virtual care setting. Apologies, I just have to, the talk appears to be on an auto advancing mode. I just have to change that. Excuse me for one moment. Okay, I hope that fixed the problem. Apologies for that. So we're going to start with a case presentation. A patient named Lisa, 35-year-old woman with confirmed asthma, who was on the fluticasone salmeterol discus at a dose of 250, one puff twice a day, also takes salbutamol as needed, has good day-to-day asthma control. So if you ask the control criteria, whether CTS, VTS, GINA, they're all quite similar, but she meets those control criteria. So her day-to-day control is good. You don't need to escalate her therapy, but she's had 2 exacerbations in the last year, one of which she came to your office for urgently, and one of which she went to the Emerge for and got prednisone. Now, you've already gone through adherence, inhaler technique, and triggers, and she's doing pretty well on all of those other facets of non-pharmacological asthma therapy. But the thing you're concerned about are those 2 exacerbations. And so the question is, could a self-management asthma action plan prevent these severe exacerbations? Let's start by, let's take a step back and talk about where action plans are situated in our asthma management strategy. So as you know, asthma is a very common chronic disease, affects about 8% of Canadians, or 2.5 million. It's a disease that continues to increase in prevalence and poses an annual economic burden of about $2 billion in this country. So very expensive in terms of productive work hours lost, and of course in terms of healthcare utilization. More than 50% of Canadian patients with asthma, however, are poorly controlled at any one time. And there are many different studies that have looked at cross-sectional control in asthma patients, prevalent asthma patients. And the question is why? Why are so many of our patients poorly controlled when we know we have such good medicines for asthma and good non-pharmacological aids as well? And it comes down to not so much that we don't have the tools, but that we are not applying the tools. So there are gaps between the best evidence and the actual practice in real world. And action plans are a very good example of where there is a major gap between evidence and practice. So as most of the folks on the webinar will know, an action plan is an individualized plan produced by a healthcare practitioner for a patient with asthma. It provides education. It gives guidelines to the patient on how to self-manage their worsening symptoms. That means how to modify their medications and when to access the medical system. This is typically how it looks. Many of you would have seen this as the Lung Health Foundation action plan. It was developed several years ago through a research study that involved input from asthma educators, respirologists, many patients, and many family doctors, and a lot of work with human factors optimization. And so the idea with action plans is that generally you have a traffic light configuration. You've got the green zone where everything's fine. You're kind of just reminding the patient of what their daily routine should be. In the yellow zone is when there's a transient loss of control, something related to often a trigger like a cold or an allergic trigger, where there's a persistent deterioration, and we are giving folks instructions on how to transiently up their therapy, intensify their therapy, to get back in their green zone, to avoid a full-blown exacerbation, which is really often the red zone, where patients are severely ill and need to urgently seek medical attention. And this plan just gives them guidelines on how to do that, how to seek urgent care, but also where they are, which zone they're in, and how to respond to each zone. And so we have had a recommendation in our guidelines, Canadian guidelines, since 1996, that every patient should get an asthma action plan. And it's very similar if you look at GINA and British guidelines in Australia. This is what it looked like in 2010, the last time it was fully reviewed. The recommendation was that all patients should have written plans for self-management that include medication adjustment in response to severity or frequency of symptoms, and medication requirements for relief of symptoms, and that was level 1 evidence. So there's no lack of evidence. In fact, there are numerous RCTs that were done in the 80s and early 90s mostly, and a review of those RCTs suggested that if you give patients a written action plan, you educate them on how to use it, and you regularly review them in the clinic, you will reduce hospitalizations, reduce emerge visits, reduce unscheduled visits to the doctor. They'll miss less work in school. They'll have less symptoms, and they'll have a better quality of life. And that was Gibson's review in 2003. And then there was a review of reviews done by Pinnock. The bottom line is that there's lots of evidence that this is effective. And some of these outcomes, you can see the risks, the relative risks. These are comparable to the benefits we would get with pharmacotherapy. So it's a non-pharmacotherapeutic intervention. It's an educational intervention, but it has a massive impact. And there was a study that suggested that having an action plan is associated with a lower risk of death. So really important. Now let's go back to the case. I hope I've convinced you that there's enough evidence. There's in fact a very strong body of evidence suggesting that someone like Lisa should get an asthma action plan. And it would probably reduce, that's the main outcome in these studies, it would probably reduce her healthcare utilization, urgent visits to your office, need for prednisone, and urgent visits to the emergency room, in addition to quality of life, improving her quality of life. So we know we should be doing it, but the problem is it's not happening. So if you look at data from Canada, there was a study by Francine Ducharme's group in 2017 that looked at primary care physicians in Quebec, and only 4% of those docs reported consistently providing a written action plan. This is Mark Fitzgerald's study from almost 15 years ago now, where they surveyed asthma patients in the community, and 11% of patients said they had ever received one. If you look at chart audits, the numbers are even lower. So there was an Alberta chart audit, again, about 20 years ago now, that looked at over a few thousand charts and found that only 2% of asthma patients in primary care had received an action plan. Our group did a chart audit in Ontario. We looked at 4 family health teams. So these are group care settings, usually more resources for care, yet out of almost 900 patients followed for a year with asthma, an average of 4 or 5 visits per patient, none of those patients received an asthma action plan. So this is something that just isn't happening. Why isn't it happening? So there are some data, some from Canada, some from other parts of the world, mostly qualitative data, sitting down with family doctors and saying, you know, what is it about these action plans and why aren't they happening? And I will say that we're not talking about the specialty context as much in these slides, but there is a massive gap in the specialty context too. And some of our work suggests that less than 10% of asthma patients being followed by respirologists are getting action plans. But if you sit down with family docs, where most of our patients are seen, primary care, they'll tell you that time is a big barrier. It does take time to... Okay. Sorry, I didn't realize that the feed had stopped, so I kept going until I got a call from Jennifer at the Lung Health Foundation. So I'm going to go back. Jennifer, were we at this case slide or were we beyond here when the feed cut out?
This, we were just coming to this. This is the second time you're bringing up Lisa, correct?
That's right, back to the case.
So, yeah, back to the case. We were just coming to this.
Okay. So what we'll do is what we've done is wrapped up the evidence around the importance of using asthma action plans and how well supported that practice is. And the idea then is to come back to the case and say that for someone like Lisa, there is a strong evidence base that she would benefit from an asthma action plan, and that we would probably be able to reduce some of these unscheduled healthcare visits that she's experiencing, and for example, her need for prednisone. The problem, however, is that there continues to be an important gap around the use of asthma action plans in the real world. And there are different ways that this gap has been measured. There was a study in Quebec, this was a survey study that looked at primary care physicians and found that only 4% of those physicians actually reported consistently providing an action plan. This is Mark Fitzgerald's study, which was a Canadian survey, looked at patients, and only 11% of patients reported receiving one. If you actually look at charts, the numbers are even lower. So there was a chart audit of several thousand patients in Alberta over 20 years ago now that looked at how many primary care patients received an action plan, and it was only 2%. We looked at 4 large family health teams in Ontario, and we found over 1 year, 4 or 5 visits per patient per year on average. None of the patients, none of almost 900 asthma patients actually received an action plan. So major gaps, despite all that strong evidence. What are the reasons for those gaps? And there have been some studies trying to figure this out. If you sit down with family docs, they'll tell you that they recognize that action plans can be valuable and are important, but they don't have time to do them. When they do think of them, they're not available to them at the point of care. They don't have the experience and knowledge around how to fill out an action plan, particularly the yellow zone of the action plan. That's something called poor self-efficacy. And there's a study this was in Kingston actually, where they were having these Lung Health Foundation educational seminars, and folks who were quite motivated and interested in action plans came to these seminars, yet 30% of them could not produce a mock action plan at the beginning of the seminar. So big knowledge gap there. In terms of outcome expectancy, some docs will tell you that they don't expect the action plan to actually be used by their patient and change the outcomes of their patients. If you ask patients, on the other hand, they'll tell you that they actually really value this tool as long as it's personalized to their situation and not given as a sort of generic form. The problem with experience and knowledge has been that the guidance that is out there is felt to be too ambiguous and complex and not to be implementable in the real world. And in 2012, the Canadian guidelines did try to offer some guidance on how to complete an asthma action plan, but largely it's been felt that that guidance was difficult to use in the real world. So if those barriers weren't enough, there are new barriers that all of us are now struggling with in the era of COVID-19. And so as many of you know, even when well, many of our asthma patients will fulfill criteria on a COVID-19 screening test. And what that means is that it's really challenging to get these patients into the office. You need full PPE. there's a risk being posed to everybody in the office environment. We estimate that less than 10% of patients with asthma are actually being seen in person. Most are being offered telephone visits. Some are being offered video calls, which obviously are superior for educational interventions like action plans and general asthma education. But there are logistical challenges with video calls. On the physician side, OTN Invite is the tool of choice by the Ministry of Health of Ontario, but there is a challenge with getting registered for OTN Invite. There's a long delay with that because so many people are trying to get registered, and there are issues with network instability because it hasn't been designed for the volume of people actually using it. There are other vendors as well, and so if you use another vendor like Zoom, some of the challenges are that you don't necessarily know if the connection is secure. There is a sort of upgraded version of Zoom that is felt to be more secure, but the conventional Zoom version has some potential HIPAA compliance issues. Also, from a provider point of view, they can only bill K codes, and for some types of providers, those K codes pay less. So it becomes a more financially challenging model for some providers. There are also technology challenges with video calls on the patient side. Although about 90% of Canadians own smartphones, that doesn't mean that they all have unlimited data. And a video call of 30, 45 minutes with education can eat up a lot of data. And that data means cost for the patient. So that's something that we have to be very sensitive about. And some of our older patients would struggle with the technology aspects like downloading an app, setting it up, and then using it effectively on the spot. So these are some of the barriers that we're facing in the current world in terms of trying to see patients as best possible virtually. And we'll come back to some of the possible solutions to these newer barriers that we're facing. But let's first talk about the conventional barriers. I think really there's no point in having a virtual visit if you don't know how to fill out an action plan. You can't do a virtual visit for asthma education with asthma action plan. So let's talk about the conventional barriers, which mostly have to do with knowledge and practice. How do you actually complete an action plan? And so there was some work done by my colleague Andrew Curry a few years ago, which tried to address this issue of how do we actually populate the yellow zone of the asthma action plan. And the goal was to create a point of care guide for how to do that. And the guide was meant to be practical and evidence-based. And so really talking about this part of the action plan here, which is really where all the action happens, and that is, I would say, the most challenging part to figure out when completing these action plans. So very quickly, the way this group went about it was to review the guidance provided on what to do in the yellow zone in any major guidelines, so GINA, BTS, SIGN, and CTS at the time. And the guidance was quite similar. GINA said to at least double ICS and increase to a dose of 2,000 BDP equivalent. BTS said a 5-fold increase in the yellow zone. CTS said a 4 to 5-fold increase for 7 to 14 days. So quite similar. Important to recognize that there have been studies of doubling that have been negative, and all the studies of quadrupling suggest that there is a benefit. So doubling is out. Quadrupling is what we are recommending, what the guidelines recommend. This is what it looked like in the 2012 Canadian Thoracic Society guideline. Just quickly, if you're on inhaled corticosteroids, you go 4-fold. Your second option, if you don't want to do this, is of course to go to prednisone. If you're on an ICS LABA, if it's budesonide for Formoterol, you can go straight to 4 puffs twice a day. If you're on one of the other combo ICS LABAs, you actually have to just increase the ICS component by 4-fold. They then actually went back to the primary literature and looked for any other studies that would support approaches for transient increase in ICS dose in patients like this, studies that hadn't been captured or that were newer after the guidelines were published. And then based on that systematic review, they tried to establish some rules on how to intensify therapy in the yellow zone. And they started with this universal recommendation to increase inhaled corticosteroids by 4 or 5-fold. The problem was, when they went out into the real world and tried to operationalize this, they found that just about 1/3 of patients were on dosing regimens where when you tried to increase it by 4 or 5-fold, you actually exceeded the Health Canada daily maximum ICS dose recommendation. And this really applies to patients who are in the moderate and severe end of the spectrum who are on higher ICS doses at baseline. When you go 4 or 5-fold, you really you hit up against that ceiling from Health Canada. So going back to the primary literature, they were able to identify alternative approaches that would still remain within the Health Canada dosing limits, but had evidence to support them for about half of those dosing situations. And in particular, for dosing situations pertaining to fluticasone, budesonide, and ciclesonide. So there are high threshold doses of those particular inhaled corticosteroids that are shown to be as effective as prednisone, in fact. And so one doesn't necessarily have to go all the way up to 4 or 5-fold if the patient is on a high baseline dose for those particular medications. And I'll show you that in the chart. That's in the chart that you have. The next question became, okay, now that we know we want to increase the dose in the yellow zone and we have an idea of how that may differ a little bit depending on the baseline dose and what molecule the patient is on, how do we actually achieve that? And there are a few different ways to do that. One can increase the number of puffs. One can increase the frequency of inhalations. You might go from BID to QID. You can actually temporarily add a new inhaler into the mix. You might replace the previous inhaler with a more potent one, or you might do a combination of those. And the reality is that, you know, any of those and or a combination of those would be a reasonable way to increase the dose. And I think this is where some of the criticism comes in, is that it's easy to say quadruple. What do you do when you're exceeding Health Canada dose limits? What do you do in terms of how do you quadruple? Do you take more puffs? Do you take it more times a day? What's the practical reality? And so there isn't much practical guidance out there. And this group tried to formulate yellow zone prescriptions in a way that, as supported by evidence, would maximize patient satisfaction and adherence and minimize patient errors when they're in the yellow zone and when they're going back from yellow to green. So a couple of the principles that they espoused, one was always maintain the maintenance green zone medication. Never stop it. It's always there. It's a bedrock. And you always add to it in the yellow zone. So that reinforces the message that you're never going to stop your green zone medication. Maintain the frequency. So people are used to taking something once a day or twice a day. They're liable to forget those extra times of day. So keep it BID. If it was started BID, just give them more puffs, the same amount of times per day, but more puffs each time. Rather than adding another inhaler, try to give more puffs of the current inhaler wherever possible. Adding an inhaler creates complexity and cost. If you do have to add a new inhaler, in some situations we have to, use the same device for obvious reasons. And don't exceed 4 inhalations per use. That's just a practical issue around how much time it takes for each puff. Quickly, what do you do when the molecule and the dose that's in front of you in terms of baseline, when you quadruple it, you exceed Health Canada daily dosing limits? A couple of different approaches to this. I often will exceed those dose limits. Arguments for doing that. Those dose limits are for chronic use, and we really are doing this for 7 to 14 days. So it's not the same risk as talking about chronic use at those high doses. It has been shown to be safe in some medication preparations. There are studies looking at very high dose ICSs in some, but not all molecules. The main goal of the action plan is to avoid systemic steroids. And if you can't quadruple the ICS, all that's left is the systemic steroid. And that's generally what we're trying to avoid. There are some folks who prefer actually to go straight to oral corticosteroids and don't have that comfort level quadrupling when they have to exceed Health Canada dose limits. Reasons for that, you will get a call from the pharmacist sometimes. You will have patients reading the monograph and telling you got it wrong. So you've got to be able to explain that, and you've got to be able to defend that position. We don't have safety data for every molecule, so some people don't feel comfortable. And ultimately, you have to have that comfort level in writing those prescriptions that exceed regulatory dose limits. But you are supported by evidence to do that, and by guidelines, or at least guidance documents out there in the literature. One other issue that comes in as a practical issue, I do have patients who are paying for their own medications, and if it's a matter of even taking more puffs, but particularly adding a new inhaler in the yellow zone, that can get quite expensive. And as many of you know, prednisone is very cheap. So many patients will actually prefer the prednisone on a cost and affordability basis. So something to keep in mind. This is what the chart looks like. You would have this chart, I think, sent to you as a PDF, and it's also downloadable directly from the Lung Health Foundation website. We tried to build this in a sort of user-friendly way. It's printable in an 8.5 by 14 format. I actually have it pinned up on the bulletin board in my office, and I look at it when I'm thinking about how to do the yellow zone. You have on one side the patient's green zone medication, and then the corresponding change to be made in the yellow zone. And as you can see, for certain options, For certain medications, you have option 1 and option 2, and those are the cases where option 1 really is you're exceeding Health Canada dose limits. So you'll see that there are footnotes there explaining that you have to decide if you're comfortable doing that, and if not, you go straight to prednisone. Let's try to operationalize that chart. I think it'd be helpful to run through it. Coming back to Lisa, this 35-year-old woman with asthma, she's had these 2 exacerbations. We know that she's on fluticasone salmeterol. Let's give her an asthma action plan. So if we start, and this is, again, the Lung Health Foundation action plan, which is, you'll have a fillable version of this online. You'll start with the header. So, you've got the date, the name, you've got the emergency contact info, the physician's contact info. If she's using a peak flow meter, a few of my patients do, but if they do, then those can be helpful thresholds to put into the action plan as well. The green zone is pretty straightforward. You can put in the action plan, put in the peak flow, then you put in the baseline medication. We learned from patients that putting in the color is really helpful, and the reliever. And then sometimes you'll add something like this. Can take 1 or 2 puffs of reliever before exercise is needed in the green zone. That's a bit of a can of worms in itself, but I put that in there. In the yellow zone, this is where, again, the action is. You can put in your peak flow. You might put in some personalizing information like Lisa can't play hockey without coughing and wheezing, and if that's happening, she's in her yellow zone. So that's as specific to that patient. Here's an activity that we know you're in your yellow zone when you're limited in this activity. Now, what do we do with her intensification? Well, the table makes it pretty easy. We want to quadruple, but we can't just take 4 puffs twice a day of Advair because that's too much salmeterol. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to add Flovent. We'll do it in a discus, so it's the same device, and we'll do it at 253 puffs twice a day. So the patient will take 1 Advair puff and 3 Flovent puffs morning, and the same thing evening, and that'll be a quadrupling of their fluticasone dose. And so we will add that in here. The orange Flovent, 3 puffs 2 times a day for 10 days. And you'll add in your Ventolin. In some patients, I might add in a comment that actually, if you're not better in 2 to 3 days, you can take prednisone. And these are patients who are excellent self-managers and whom you can give a backup prednisone prescription to and trust that they won't use it for the wrong reasons. And then finally, the red zone is quite straightforward, very low peak flow, lots of symptoms. We want patients to take their rescue and make their way back into the healthcare system urgently. So that's what Lisa's action plan would look like. It can be done reasonably quickly, but I think, the issue of figuring out what the doses are can be helped by this chart, but ultimately you still have to fill it out and you still have to explain it to the patient. A couple of other quick examples and a couple of polls will do. We've lost a little bit of time with the technical glitches, so I'll try to go a little bit faster here. What if this patient was actually on budesonide formoterol, 200 micrograms, 1 puff twice a day? So what would we do for her yellow zone? You should get a pop-up questionnaire for this. And your options are to either add the 100 microgram twice a day, to increase her 200 to 4 puffs twice a day, increase it to 2 puffs 4 times a day, so still 8 puffs, but a different style of getting to 8 puffs, or you can just go straight to prednisone. And what would be the evidence-based recommendation for the yellow zone of the action plan for this particular patient on this medication? Give you a few seconds there. You can fill it out and click submit. Okay, and let's see what we got there. We'll be able to see the answers. And so about 3/4 of you got it right. We want to increase to 4 puffs twice a day. About 1/4 of you said to actually stick to the 200, but go to 2 puffs 4 times a day. It's not that it's wrong in terms of total cumulative dosing there. We're still quadrupling the dose. The issue is that patients get into a routine, and if they're used to taking something twice a day, it's challenging for them to take something 4 times a day. And there are literature to suggest that patients, when you make a change in the frequency regimen, is when you're liable to get dosing errors. So apply those same rules to changes we want to make in the yellow zone, and we try to stick to the same frequency regimen. And that's the thinking behind that. So different ways to do it. Not saying it's necessarily wrong, but some evidence to support that patients might miss less doses if you stick with their usual dosing regimen. Okay, so moving on. this is what that action plan would look like. You got your red Symbicort, four puffs 2 times a day, and then you've got, in this case, Bricanel, just another example. We'll do one more quickly. What if this patient was on one of the newer inhaled corticosteroids, a fluticasone furoate by a Ellipta device at the 100 microgram dose? And so the question is, what would we do in the yellow zone for this patient? And so that question you'll see pop up as well. And do we increase to 8 puffs twice a day? Do we increase to 4 puffs once a day? Do we actually add the 200 dose at 2 puffs a day? Or do we add prednisone in this patient? So you should see that pop up. Not seeing it yet. There it is. So take a moment to fill that out, what you think should happen for this patient. We'll give that a few seconds. Okay, let's take a look at what people thought. Great, so most of you simply quadrupled. And what's interesting about this particular molecule and this particular dose is that, unfortunately, when you quadruple, which seems like the right thing to do, and this is what I would do in my practice, you do exceed the Health Canada maximum daily dose recommendation. And that is something that you have to be comfortable doing. Another option is to add prednisone. And so basically there's no right or wrong. I would prefer to actually temporarily exceed Health Canada limits, and most patients are comfortable with that as well. But if you don't feel you're comfortable, and or if the patient's not comfortable, then you can go straight to prednisone in a case like this where we don't have the data. Quickly talking about some of the aspects of asthma management that are unique in the COVID era. Talk to you a little bit about technology and tools that are available out there that you might want to look into and learn more about, and that are emerging. So what about action plans? So you can create the plan. We just talked about how we can do that a little bit more efficiently with the help of something like the Yellow Zone tool, which is available to you online through the Lung Health Foundation. You can discuss that by phone and video, but how do you actually get the plan into the patient's hands? And here we're really going to now start thinking about electronic ways to do that. So technologies to do that. And as you know, there are many apps out there on the App Store, Google Play or iOS App Store, that help patients to manage their asthma, and many of those asthma management apps have action plans in them. The one I want to talk about a little bit is the Breathe app, partly because I was involved in it, but also largely because it's a Canadian app developed by researchers. It's an app that's been studied and published and supported, very much supported by the Lung Health Foundation. The Breathe app is very useful to patients in our current environment because what it enables them to do is to actually enter the medications for each of their zones. And then it tells them, it actually has them log their symptoms, and it tells them which zone they're in. It auto-calculates which zone they're in and gives them the advice from that zone. So I find this to be a very practical thing because even in the before COVID, in the normal times, giving patients a piece of paper, you know, some patients would religiously hold on to that, but many patients would lose it. And they won't have it with them when they need it most, when they're on vacation or when they're in an unusual circumstance and their asthma flares. But people always have their phones, and so this would always be available to them. And the Breathe app is neat because it has this chat bot that enables folks to very easily enter their symptoms, and it then auto-calculates their zone and feeds that back to them. So something to look into. How do you deliver inhaler education? Well, if you're on a video chat, you can demonstrate and you can review. That actually can be quite effective. What if you're doing this by phone? So you can talk the patient through it, and then you can have them actually view the Lung Health Foundation technique videos. So you have a technique video for every single different type of device on the Lung Health Foundation website. This is what that web page looks like. A little bit tricky to find. You got to go to A to Z and then asthma and then how to use inhalers. We can send that link out as well at the end of the webinar here. But there's also some new tech I want to touch on. Many of you would have heard of Propeller. It's a large US company that produces this tiny little device here that you put onto the MDI. There's actually a similar device for other types of inhalers as well. And what it's mostly designed to do is to give adherence data. So it connects to an app, and sometimes you can even have reports that clinicians can look up if they go to a certain website that's password protected for their patients. and they can determine how often their patients are activating that device and using that device. So that's helpful for adherence, but not so helpful for technique. But the reason I bring this up is that there's a newer company called Breathe Suite, and this is kind of like Propeller on steroids. What's nice about Breathe Suite is that it's a Canadian company from out east, from Newfoundland, and they have a similar looking device right now just for MDIs, but they're working on other devices. But you add it on to the top of the inhaler, and it not only tells adherence data, but it actually tells you something about the quality, the technique. And so they're actually looking at things like the timing of the inhalation of the patient relative to the activation of the puffer. They're going to tell you about inspiratory flow rates and how adequate those are. There's even an accelerometer in there that tells you how well the patient has shaken that puffer. So this is something that is undergoing FDA approval right now and will be released in the States soon. And they are looking to release this in Canada. So it's not quite ready yet, but all that to say that very soon we will have more and more tools that will empower us to electronically do some of the things that we've conventionally done in person. And I think this will be more effective when we have these kinds of monitoring tools in place. How do you assess lung function? I want to quickly touch on this. We need lung function obviously for diagnosis in airways disease, but also for monitoring. Because pulmonary function testing is widely considered an aerosol generating medical procedure, AGMP, there is very much, there's very limited access to lab capacity right now. And so what other tools might we consider for patients out there? So there are portable electronic spirometers. They're quite expensive and you have to validate them against the lab, but they've been around for a while, and I think it's time to really start thinking about these tools because of COVID-19. Exhaled nitric oxide, that is not aerosol generating, it's a slow breath, and it's very good for diagnosis and monitoring in asthma. And there are even portable handheld devices that patients can use at home. So better for the lab situation because it doesn't generate aerosols, but also available for home monitoring. And then there's airwave oscillometry, a little bit newer and less well established, but no coaching needed. Again, you have portable devices for patients, and this tells you a lot about airways disease. We just need a little bit more info on reference values, and again, the cost needs to come down. But some of these are coming, some of these are already here. I would say to start with, portable electronic spirometers. We need to see the use of that going up. Symptoms and exacerbations and improved quality of care, we have lots of evidence for that. Despite that evidence, usage is low, and that's because it is complex. It does take time. The action plan yellow zone formulation table, I think, addresses at least one part of that, one barrier, which is the knowledge and the confidence that clinicians have in completing that action plan. So it helps to make that more practical and probably more efficient. There are new tools that we need to really think about for our patients in the COVID-19 era. EAMS is one of those tools. It's EMR integrated and it's evidence-based. That's a tool that's currently available in the Oscar EMR, and we are in the beta testing phase of integrating that in the PSS or TELUS EMR, and we're very much looking for folks who are interested in testing that out for us in TELUS as well. So thank you all for your attention. There are many resources by the PEP program of the Lung Health Foundation that are listed here that are available to you online. Many of these, what used to be in-person workshops, are being offered in this way, and hopefully you can benefit from them. If you're interested in learning more about the electronic asthma management system, if you, for example, are in an Oscar clinic and you'd like to use this tool, we'd love to have you use the tool. Or if you're in a PSS clinic and you'd be interested in helping us sort out, testing of this in an actual PSS clinic, please do email me. My email is right here. And any further questions you have, I'd be happy to take. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. That was great. And I do apologize to everyone for the technical difficulties. And I do see a number of questions in the Q&A box. Did you want to have a look at those, Dr. Gupta, in the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. We'll start with the Q&A now. And I will just go through some of these questions as they come up. Can you guys see the questions, or?
No, we don't see them.
Okay. Well, I'll read out the questions in that case. There's a question, prescribing written action plans is certainly a problem, but even once we do prescribe them, how do we support patients in using them and making sure they recognize when they're in which zone? And the question is, can technology help? I think that there are barriers at every level. There are barriers that, like you say, to get that action plan into patients' hands, that we're failing dismally at that. But once it's in their hands, you're right that some patients don't use it, can't use it, don't remember to use it, and we've all faced that. So I think a lot of that is the education that happens when the action plan is delivered, but I do think that technology can also enable more appropriate, efficient, and effective use of these action plans. And that's where something like the Breathe app and other apps like it, I think, can help. And what they're effectively doing is, instead of, having patients always think about, are my symptoms enough for me to be in the yellow or the red, and what am I supposed to do? It just becomes sort of a logging interface where they log their symptoms, and the app takes care of figuring out if they're in a situation where they need to augment therapy. So it becomes like a living action plan, and part of it is just getting patients to engage and actually, add their symptoms and continuously log. And not every patient is engaged to do that, but once they start seeing the benefit, the feedback, and the advice from the app, I think people will be more convinced to do that. So I think technology will help us to do that. There's still lots we have to learn about how to get patients to engage. Corinne, so there's a question here, Corinne Woodley, are we still using Advair? I think that might be a question pertaining to the generic sub that's happening with Wixela for patients who are on government programs, but certainly there are many patients who are still using Advair who are covered through other mechanisms such as private insurance, and there's also a patient support program through GSK whereby the cost of Advair is subsidized down to the cost of the newer Wixela, which is about half the cost of the Advair. There's a question, questions are popping in quickly, so I don't want to miss too many. I'll go to the bottom quickly here. Can I get a copy of the slides? So practical question, this presentation will be posted on the Lung Health Foundation website, and so you'll receive a link as well on how to access that after the fact. The majority of asthma exacerbations end up in urgent care, not with their primary care provider. Do you have a fast and abbreviated version of the action plan that can be delivered in this setting? So it's a good question. I think our goal with action plans is to prevent people from getting into urgent care settings, to have them take some actions before they're in the urgent care setting to avert the need for urgent care. But you're right that currently many patients will go straight to urgent care rather than going to a walk-in or rather than calling their family doc. There is an action plan as part of the emergency department care pathway that was developed in conjunction with the Lung Health Foundation. And that is an action plan that's a little bit of an abbreviated version, as you say, to be more practically used by emerge docs in that emergency setting. And it's sort of a stopgap to get something in patients' hands to empower them. So that is available and will also be available on the Lung Health Foundation website. Okay. Are people with exercise-induced asthma as susceptible to greater severity of COVID-19 if acquired? So I really don't know the answer to that. There are zero data to guide us on that. I can tell you more broadly about asthma is that initially I was telling pretty much all my patients with asthma early in the COVID-19 days that I worried that because viruses are common triggers for asthma exacerbations, that if they got COVID-19, their disease would be more severe because they would have to deal with two problems, asthma and COVID-19. But as it turns out, if you look at the large epi data sets from mostly from China and the US, it doesn't look like asthma was represented anymore. In fact, it was represented less than the population prevalence in cohorts of patients who were admitted to hospital. So that's actually very reassuring. And my advice has changed now to say that the typical well-controlled asthmatic probably isn't at higher risk of a severe COVID-19 infection. Patients who have fixed airways obstruction, I think of them more as COPD patients. As you know, many of our asthma patients do have fixed airway obstruction. So if there is lung function impairment, I hold judgment on that, and I do worry more about those patients. But well-controlled asthma patients with normal lung function or minimally impaired lung function, based on recent data, I'm much less worried about those patients with respect to risk of a severe COVID-19 infection. Time for a few more. Clarification, if the patient is on Brio, do you recommend quadrupling the dose based on ICS amount or adding another ICS? Very good question. Something we struggled with a lot when writing up those recommendations. Vilanterol is a newer molecule, but there are two different pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic studies out there that suggest that vilanterol, even at the 100 microgram per day dose, is safe. And so that's a judgment call. The recommendation is to either quadruple that Brio based on the safety data for vilanterol that are out there at those high doses, or to go straight to prednisone. But certainly if you don't feel comfortable going to a 100 microgram vilanterol dose, and you might not feel so in, for example, a patient with cardiac arrhythmia, then another option is to separately add the fluticasone furoate inhaled corticosteroid and leave the current Brio as it is. But generally speaking, the reason we went to quadrupling the Brio is that it's cheaper and simpler for the patient to keep using the same inhaler that they already have when they're in that yellow zone. Question around which EMR supports the electronic asthma management system. Right now it's Oscar, but very soon it's also going to be PSS or TELUS. So if you're using one of those two EMRs, we'd be happy to engage. Please email me. We could talk about how to get the system into your clinics. When would you add a LAMA is a question that's coming up. A LAMA really isn't part of management for acute loss of asthma control. There's really no evidence for addition of a LAMA in the yellow zone of the action plan. As many of you know, there is a role for LAMA in step-up therapy for poor baseline control of asthma, and that's really something that we start considering once we have poor control in patients on high doses of inhaled corticosteroids and LABAs who are still exacerbating through that therapy. LAMAs are shown to reduce exacerbation rate in those patients with severe asthma. Is the Breathe app free of charge? It is free of charge. It's downloadable from the App Store, free of charge for your patients, absolutely. Okay, I think I better wrap up there. It's 1 o'clock. We have lots of questions. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your engagement and your time today.
Yes, I just want to reiterate that. Thank you for attending and for your questions. If we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to get in touch with you afterwards and try to address it then. And thank you again, Dr. Gupta, for taking time today very much. It was an excellent webinar. And when we close out the meeting, I just want to encourage everyone to just answer I think there's one question and it's feedback for us. So please take that opportunity. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.